Welcome back to the 12th and last session of a lecture on international political economy, which will, on the one hand, discuss the role of ideas in international political economy, and on the other hand, give a short summary and a brief outlook concerning the topics of this lecture. Thus, the unofficial subtitle this week will be "So What?" And unsurprisingly, we're at the end of our whole lecture now. We have covered quite a few areas, I think, in the last 12 sessions that we had together. And next week we'll only have the exam left. Today's session will be structured in 3 parts. First, I'll briefly discuss the role of ideas in international political economy. Then I'll recapitulate the main ideas of the lecture. And at the end, I'll give you some ideas on what we should think about concerning the future of international political economy. So let's discuss ideas in international political economy. I think the textbook does a pretty good job of covering the field of the different positions that are there on the field, and roughly you can characterize all positions that scholars on the field of international political economy have concerning ideas in 2 dimensions. So first, there is the question of how relevant the ideas, the role of ideas are in IPE. So is the role of ideas merely secondary? So is what happens in the international political economy actually mostly driven and determined by material interests and material interactions such as trade interactions and investment, and that's what's really structuring the international political economy, and ideas are only our way to make sense of it, as we would probably think about astrophysics, for example. There it doesn't really matter to the movement of the sun and the stars what we think about and theorize about it. That's just there are 2 processes that are totally decoupled from another. So the movement of the stars and our ideas on the movement of the stars, they don't have much to do with one another. And some authors think like this when it comes to international political economy. They think these are processes that happen and there are kind of natural laws to them, and we as scholars should try to be as good and neutral scholars of these processes as the astrophysicists are scholars of the movement of the stars and planets. However, in international political economy, there's also the opposite position. There are some authors who claim that the ideas that are out there in the world concerning international political economy actually are a part of international political economy itself. So if a lot of people have very liberal ideas of international political economy and think that the greatest wealth for everyone will come by free trade and free flow of capital and so on, then the whole international political economy will work differently than in a world where a lot of people have other ideas on what the international political economy should be structured like, because these people are then also heads of governments maybe, or maybe CEOs of big companies, and they have some room to make decisions, and these are determined by ideas. And here we can say there's certainly quite a few people that are at the very bottom of this spectrum here, so that probably don't even think about the role of ideas. And we have those at the very right and the very left of the political spectrum, if you will. So we have some Marxist authors that would probably not give too much on the question of ideas, and we also have some hardcore liberal authors who think, well, no, we should do this as we do the natural sciences, and probably there's hardly anyone at the very top of the spectrum, so hardly anyone will say it's all about ideas and material interactions and interests do not matter. However, there are many authors who argue that ideas do matter and ideas do influence the way the international political economy is structured and is working. The second axis is here the x-axis, and here the question is how objective or subjective are the ideas on international political economy that are out there. So is there always one simple truth on these questions, or is this highly subjective, the way we describe international political economy, and are different positions not defined by one being true and one being false, but by them just being different, and then you would have a rather relativistic approach to these. And once again, in astrophysics, we would probably argue, no, there's maybe not always one true and one false position, but definitely there is truth, and falseness is something that applies here strongly. And if you don't believe in the laws of gravity, then you're just wrong. In international political economy, it is at least more complicated than that, because as you hopefully have seen over the course of the last 3.5 months, is that within the scholarly community of scholars of international political economy, there are very strongly conflicting opinions that conflict far more strongly than they would in astrophysics. So it is not so easy, at least, to identify that one scientifically true point. And it's always hard to argue, well, is free trade better for development or is it not? And you can perform studies on this. I'm not saying that everyone can just say whatever they want, but it's not that easy to define the one objectively true position. And once again, if you look at the spectrum, we have quite a few positions that would be at the very left of this spectrum from your side, so that would think, well, no, the way we describe international political economy is the way it actually is, and the others are just wrong. So I do see that I am liberal and there are Marxists and feminists and whatever out there, but they are wrong and I am right. And you find these kind of positions once again on the very left, on the very right. So you find neoliberals who argue like this, you find Marxists who argue like this. However, on the other hand, you also have authors that argue, no, there are different positions that you can both justify rationally, and you cannot simply decide one is true and one is false. Rather, they represent different ways of approaching international political economy. And once again, probably very few people in international political economy would be at the far end of this spectrum, so would say, well, it's all totally subjective and everyone can say what they want. However, there are authors who argue you can take different positions with good reasons, and this is not just something that means one is wrong and one is right. And so you can, if you take individual approaches in international political economy, you can put them at different points in these two-dimensional schemes, and there are probably quite a few that are at the very bottom left of this scheme, and the others are at other points there. Probably none is at the very far left, and you don't have to take both positions at the same time. So you can, for example, argue at the topmost cross here would represent that you say, well, ideas are highly relevant in international political economy, but that doesn't mean that's not one of them is right and the other is wrong. So you can argue, well, Marxism is real, it's an idea that's out there, and it's a dangerous idea, and it can have real life impacts if many people believe in Marxism, but Marxists are just wrong. So just meaning ideas are relevant doesn't mean that you are in the slightest sense relativistic. And you can of course argue the same way if you are yourself some kind of orthodox Marxist. You can argue the same way about certain strands of liberalism, that they are out there, that they have impact, that they are important, and they are plainly wrong. And on the other hand, you can also take a position that ideas are not really objective, but you can still argue that, well, they are not really important either. So those two dimensions are kind of independent from one another. However, you probably see a conglomeration of positions at the bottom left of this diagram. So now I want to just introduce you briefly to one specific approach on this, which would be probably somewhere in the middle, and this is Gramscianism or Neo-Gramscianism. And this diagram that I show you right now, you might have seen this in the PowerPoint presentation for one of the earlier sessions of this lecture, because I already included it then, but then I cut it out of the video because the video was unfortunately way too long. But I forgot to cut it out of the PowerPoint as I realized later. So you saw this slide, and now I have the opportunity to describe you what I want here. And just first, here are some basic ideas of what a Gramscian perspective is on. And this is an example where different approaches in the field use the same words, but they mean very different things by it. So, for example, we can distinguish something that I just like very broadly dub the mainstream perspective, and I juxtapose it with a Gramscian perspective. So in the mainstream perspective, if we talk about the state, we will mostly find some kind of Weberian perspective on the state, and Weber's famous definition of the state is that the form of a human community that successfully lays claim to the monopoly of legitimate use of physical violence within a given territory. So a state is the monopoly of violence in a certain territory, and then you can also add over a certain population in that territory. And this is what you understand to be the state, and then you think of those state institutions that organize this community defined by the monopoly of violence. So you think of the governments, you think of the police, and you think of all other institutions defined by the laws of this very state. And then in this mainstream perspective, you also have a notion of civil society that mostly came up in the 1980s, 1990s in political science research and sociological research. And their authors emphasize that even though the state are those institutions, there's also the civil society out at the state, and this is where different social actors can make their claims, and then this is also the place where deliberations and discourses can take place that finally shape the decisions of the state institutions or the political decisions. So it's not just that the politicians in parliament and the administrative workers in the institutions make the decisions and then decide for what purposes the means at the hand of the state are used. But outside these institutions, there is this whole civil society where just like maybe small organizations that are not part of the state, maybe the church, maybe also a certain, or maybe trade unions, maybe feminist groups, whatever kind of groups make their different claims, and they articulate what they find to be social problems and find to be good solutions, and then this is discussed publicly, and there's an exchange of reasons, and this then is the context in which the state institutions make their decisions, at least in a democracy. And if we want to understand democracy, we shouldn't simply look at the institutions, we should also look at the discourses in civil society. And finally, in mainstream perspective, you also find the notion of hegemony. This is, for example, mostly used in international relations theory, where it is the position of dominance that one state has in an international system, and this position of dominance is then based on having superior material resources. So the hegemonic state probably has more money and more means to produce more wealth, and they certainly also have the stronger military capability, and this is then what their position of hegemony is based on in this international system, and this gives them leverage to wield influence over other actors and to structure the whole system maybe. Gramscian perspectives will use the very same terms, but they mean something slightly or radically different than the mainstream perspective. When it comes to the state, Gramscians actually have two different concepts of the state, or two different ways in which the term is used. So on the one hand, they use the term state in the meaning of the integral state, and this they not define outrightly at the state institutions. Rather, they have a Marxist background, so they see society as a society of class domination. So we have classes that have more control over production, that receive more of the benefits of production, and we have other classes that are less benefited. So the state then, from this perspective, is the whole machinery of social institutions that realize the rule of the ruling class. And so it's not necessarily defined or confined to the legitimate use of force, but all other kind of aspects that realize this dominance also. And this is then structured in two parts. This integral state, on the one hand, we have the political society, and as political society, Gramscians term what is often called the state in the narrow sense, and sometimes in Gramsci you also find that he speaks of the state and only means the political society and not the integral state. And then on the other hand, there's also the civil society, which in Gramscian terminology is also part of the state. And why is this so? Because the civil society, as part of the integral state, is once again all the very same institutions that probably liberal mainstream theorists would also call the civil society. However, you look at it very differently now, because now you look at the civil society not as a sphere in which different claims are made, and then we have beautiful deliberation and articulation of those claims, and then we have democratic decisions. Rather, the civil society is also part of this structure of dominance. So being part of this civil society in this sense means that you become part of the whole structure of dominance, and this is also where dominant ideas and dominant ideology gains their relevance. And so by having the church in civil society, from Gramscian perspective, this does not mean you have specific interests that can be articulated there. Rather, you have an institution that deploys a certain ideology that will help make the integral state run, and it will help have the dominance of the ruling class maintained. And this then, once again, is related to the notion of hegemony that Gramscians use. And this is not about the dominance of one state, rather it's about the dominance of certain ideas, if you will, and these ideas are always the ideas of the ruling class. And the state of hegemony is used if those that are dominated agree to the ideas that justify their own domination. And this sounds silly, however, I think the textbook gives a good example for looking at this, because if you have a certain Marxist perspective, then you would say that this whole set of ideas that are part of the so-called Washington Consensus, so that you are for free trade, that you are for a small state, that you are for a state that keeps out of the economy, that you are for free flow of capital and investment, and all of these things, if you come from a Marxist perspective, you will say, well, this is actually not something that will benefit everyone. That is something that will benefit big corporation. That's something that will benefit the richer countries where these corporations are home, but will probably not benefit workers in any of the countries, and it will probably also not benefit the least developed countries. However, if we look at least from 1980 to 2007 maybe, these kinds of ideas were dominant, and many leaders of the poorer nations and also of other parts of society bought into these very ideas that free trade and economic liberalism are good for everyone. So if you take this Gramscian perspective, you can say, well, this is a classic case of hegemony, because those who were dominated agreed with the ideas that de facto justified their dominatedness or the domination over them. So what you see here is that with those lines of thoughts, you use the very same words, however you define them somewhat different, and then you see different things. So you see the world differently. And finally, to lead this back to the diagram that I just had before, you probably would put Neo-Gramscianism somewhere in the middle, because Gramscians, they would never disregard the role of material interests or the role of material interactions. However, they would neither disregard the role of ideas, because what they see if they look at civil society and they look at the integral state is they always see an ideational struggle for hegemony. So they see that the different classes have their different ideologies, and these then are pitted against one another in civil society, and then one or the other might become hegemonic. And this means that to some extent, or at least Gramscians are not objectivist in the sense that they would say, well, there is just this one true set of ideas concerning the economy and all others are false. Rather, these sets of ideas are attached to a certain class position and to certain interests. However, most Gramscians are not reductionist relativists in a sense. They would still see that these positions can either they are either more coherent or less coherent, and they can give better or not so good reasons for their position. So it's not absolute relativism. And this ideational struggle then in turn is related to material class struggle, and this material class struggle is once again the basis for the ideational struggle. And you can, with different kind of articulations of this set of ideas, you can also look at gender relations or race relations. And if you're a good Gramscian, you would always couple this with the discussion of class relations. For example, one scholar who does this, not particularly in international political economy, is Stuart Hall. And the one scholar that applies this mostly to international political economy, the Neo-Gramscian, is Robert Cox. Okay, now we come to the brief recapitulation of the lecture. So I'll make this very brief. In the first 3 sessions, or in session 2 until 4, we discussed the history of today's global political economy, and what we discussed there is development from the top left map here, which showed the international political economy in 1400, where there are a lot of regional economies with established trade routes, and some of them were stronger, some of them were weaker. So probably the South Asian one and the East Asian one were the most active and richest and wealthiest and most productive of these regional economies, and they were then connected via different trade routes all the way to to the Atlantic, so from the Pacific to the Atlantic via the whole Eurasian, African landmass and the coasts of these continents. And then we also had some regional economies in the Africas. Then a lot of things happened, mainly colonialism and the advent of modernity and capitalism. And we had the world on the top right side here. So the world in which European countries dominated almost every other country and every other continent in the world. Not all of them at the same time, but first the Americas, then Asia and Africa and Australia. So it was not all at the same time. But in the end, it was pretty much all of the world that the European dominated and shaped, and thereby also in a very violent fashion forged the world into one world out of many. Then after World War II, we had this time of the three worlds, so the Western Bloc, the Eastern Bloc, and the non-aligned countries. And finally, we might argue that after 1990, we were moving to the direction of one globalized world. However, if we have this notion where we have one globalized world, everyone's liberal and democratic now, we have to realize that in fact not everyone is liberal and democratic. And when we look at trade, that it's mostly triadic trade. So it's trade between Europe, North America, and Eastern Asia, and many other parts of the world are not that well integrated into this system. This was this part of the lecture, and after that we mostly discussed, well, how does international political economy work? And there I showed you different variations of this diagram. And by this diagram I wanted to show you that if we want to look at international political economy today, we look at capitalism. And if we look at capitalism, we should not only look at who's getting rich and who's not getting rich or so. We should look at the conditions under which capitalist production can work and under which it works and under which it can realize its potential of producing a lot of wealth that is then typically unevenly distributed. And what capitalism mostly needs is capital and labor, and then it also needs land and quite a few of other social conditions that I'm not gonna enumerate here one by one. And then we discussed on what particularly capital needed, and we discussed on the international flows of investment, and we also discussed the financial system, because capitalism always needs a credit system and always needs a banking or financial system. Without that, the whole circle of investments would not work. Then we also discussed the question of labor, which is oftentimes only viewed as wage labor, and which also needs certain conditions to be available to capitalism. So there must be enough people that are willing to work under the current conditions given by capitalism. And also looking at labor is also the place where we can best look at inequalities. So these are gendered inequalities, these are racialized inequalities, and these are also global inequalities with certain forms of socially not respected and also particularly unpleasant forms of labor being externalized to other countries, to women, to racialized groups, and get generally socially downward. So this is the dynamics of labor, but we can also look at the question, okay, how much of the share of wealth ends up with labor and how much ends up with capital? And here the relation between the two shifted over the last 40 years or so. So more and more of the wealth that is being produced ends up with capital rather than with labor. Then finally, last week we also discussed that capitalism always needs a natural environment to function. So it cannot function just somewhere in space where people cannot live. It can only function in a world where human beings can survive and where there is land and so on. However, capitalism also has adverse effects on this natural environment. So capitalism typically produces pollution. It produces particularly carbon emission, which might then in turn lead to global warming, which might then in turn destroy the very conditions that capitalism needs to function, and that not only capitalism needs to function, that human beings need to live. So whatever you think of what capitalism has done to us or for us over the last 200 years or so, I think I gave you the possibility to form your own opinion on that. I hopefully did so. I hopefully did not indoctrinate you in any kind of way, which would be hard because I'm kind of undecided here. Whatever we think about what capitalism did to us or for us over the last 200 years, we certainly should look out whether our living conditions will still be there in 100 years or not. So this leads us to the last part of today's session, which I dubbed Ideas for the Future. So here I would just want to briefly name 3 big challenges that I think the international political economy faces. So the international political economy as the social system that's out there, but also in a way the academic discipline. So first, there is the question of the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, which I discussed quite a bit, particularly at the beginning of the lecture. And right now, I'm personally maybe a little bit less pessimistic than I was at the beginning. However, the economic challenges are big and mounting, and we don't know where the pandemic is gonna go in fall and winter. So in the fall and winter in the northern hemisphere, of course, it's winter right now in the southern hemisphere. However, we'll see how it goes when winter strikes in Europe, where the pandemic seems to be kind of under control right now. The same goes for the parts of Eastern Asia, where it kind of seems under control right now. And well, Northern America is already not under control anymore. So if autumn and winter strike in these areas, then we might see first effects on the public health, and then also effects on the political economy of the whole thing. And then we'll have to see whether we should get more pessimistic once again. However, my pessimism, optimism aside, there's definitely a question of how this recovery will work and what the lasting effects will be. So will there be a lasting effect on the relation between the state and the market? So will the state in general be strengthened, or will this just be a very short-lived episode and then the neoliberals will take over again? We have to see about that. We can also ask, well, will this shift of power from North America and Europe towards Eastern Asia, towards China in particular, will this be accelerated by the crisis, or will it just go on like it did before, or is there some other development? Will there be some kind of deglobalization? Or these are, I think, still very much open questions, and we'll have to see about this, and we have to think about it also. Secondly, of course, we have to address global warming. I'm not going to say much about this today because I just discussed it extensively last week. And I also discussed it 3 minutes ago. So this is obviously a big topic that needs to be discussed and addressed. And finally, there is the lasting problem of overcoming poverty and inequality, and by what means and when one can do this. I think normatively almost everyone agrees that no one should starve to death. However, there is quite a bit of disagreement how we get to a world in which no one has to starve to death. And this is of course connected to the whole question of development, if you still like this term. And as if those 3 challenges weren't big enough, of course, they are connected to one another. and something that might be good in one of these three areas might not be good in the others. So if we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, we might argue, well, it's important that we just ramp up production as soon as possible to the old levels. And then we might say, well, would this be ecologically the best, or should we not maybe maintain a lower level of air traffic despite having some economic costs to the air traffic industry and so on? And similarly, there are also trade-offs between addressing question of development quickly and addressing the long-term effects of it in relation to global warming. And there's also the question, it's always the case that when there are crises in the richer countries, then there is less attention for the poorer countries in the richer countries. And there might also be a problem that if the richer countries are struggling that much to overcome their own crisis, that they will do so at the cost of the poorer countries. So all of these three challenges of international political economy are interconnected. So what's left at the end of our whole lecture? I hope I gave you some ideas on what to think about when you think about the international political economy. I hope you learned something and you are now better able to understand what's happening in the world of international political economy, and you're also hopefully more interested in what's happening there, and see that this stuff is really, really important for the future of mankind. And maybe some of you are so interested that you become interested in becoming scholars of international political economy, and if you don't, that's also totally fine. But hopefully having these ideas also helps you become, as a citizen, more competent in having your own positions on questions of international political economy. So I'm very glad that you stayed with me till the very end. Thank you very much, and enjoy the summer. Goodbye.